A few years ago, I found myself in a conversation about a young person who had made a terrible decision. And before anyone asked, like, what happened or what type of life they had and what they experienced, or before someone asked, like, what led to that moment, people were already explaining who they were. There are people who are labeling him as dangerous and calling him troubled, and some people blame the parents, and some people blame the schools, and some people blame the neighborhood. And it just seemed like everyone felt determined to find a cause. Like they just needed something or someone to blame. And as I'm listening, I just kept wondering, how often do we become more interested in assigning responsibility than understanding how a person arrived at that moment in the first place? Because those are not the same thing. And that difference matters. I'm Dr. James Bell III. I'm the host of the Equity Matters podcast, and this is In the Margins. And this space is created to look at books that have been challenged and pushed to the edges and ask, what do these stories reveal about the systems that we're living inside of right now, today? Richard Wright's Native Son forces readers into that kind of tension unapologetically. At the center of the novel, you have Bigger Thomas, a young black man whose actions set off a chain of devastating events. And for generations, readers have argued about who Bigger is. Is he a criminal? Is he a victim? Is he merely a product of his environment? I argue he is a young man making choices, but more on that in a moment. Today, we're going to talk about why Native Son remains one of the most challenged and controversial novels in American literature. We're going to talk about fear, not necessarily as the emotion, but as the condition that people learn to live inside. We're going to explore the difference between understanding and excusing harm, and we'll examine the question that sits at the heart of the novel. What does freedom really mean when your opportunities, your choices, and your future have already been constrained by forces beyond your control? Because maybe the most uncomfortable thing about Native Son isn't the violence. It could be the possibility that individual choices and social conditions can both be true at the same time. So let's start with the most uncomfortable part of this book, the violence. Because the novel doesn't let us look away, and therefore I can't either. Early in Native Son, Bigger Thomas kills Mary Dalton. The killing is not premeditated, it is actually the result of panicking. Bigger was in a room that he was never supposed to be in, doing a job that put him in an impossible position. He was serving the white family that employed him, and he was terrified of what could happen if he was discovered. And so he makes a split-second decision that ends her life, and that's the fact of it. And here's where most readers and most of the novel's critics over the decades typically stop. They take that act and use it to define the entire person. Bigger becomes the violence, and the violence becomes the verdict. But Wright doesn't let us stop there. He actually forces us to ask, what is the emotional and psychological world Bigger is living in before that moment? And the answer that Wright gives us, page after page and scene after scene, is fear. And it's not the kind of fear that you feel when watching a horror movie. I know that one very well because I love a good horror film. But it's not a passing feeling. Wright, in fact, he writes fear as a permanent condition. It is like the air that Bigger breathes. It is the lens through which he sees every interaction with white America. Every room that he enters, every job that he takes, every instruction that he receives carries this undercurrent of what could happen to him. Not what might, but what could at any given moment. Now think about it. This is the world that Wright is documenting. This is 1930 Chicago. You have redlining, you have overcrowded black neighborhoods deliberately kept that way, and a justice system that was designed for Bigger to never receive justice. It's a society that had already decided who he was before he even opened his mouth. But fear is not an excuse for what bigger does. It's merely the context. And what I want to make sure people get is that context here is not the same as justification. That distinction between context and justification is one of the more important ideas in this novel. And it is one of the reasons the book has been challenged and banned, because some people don't want to make that distinction. They would rather the violence be the whole story. They would rather not ask what built the conditions that produced the moment. But Richard Wright asks anyway. Bigger makes choices. I mentioned that in the beginning. He makes real ones. He kills Mary, and then he kills again Bessie, the woman that he was in a relationship with, in a moment that is, if anything, even harder to sit with than the first killing, because there is no panic defense to reach for, because Bessie was black and she posed no institutional threat to him. What Bigger does to Bessie is a consequence of his own fear and his own sense of this cornered self-preservation. It's an act of harm against someone who was also trapped by the same world that trapped him. And can I say that doesn't make it okay? Because it doesn't make it okay. Wright does not hide this or soften it, and we can't either. Bigger is not a hero. He is not a symbol of righteous resistance. He is a human being who causes real, devastating harm to real people. He is also a human being who was never given the conditions to develop any other relationship to the world. Both of these things are true. And what Wright is doing here, and why this novel made people uncomfortable since 1940, is refusing to let us use Bigger's harm to avoid examining the harm done to him. Not instead of examining it alongside it, because that's a harder thing to hold. It's much easier for us to say that Bigger did some terrible things, full stop, close the book, or to say Bigger was a product of a racist system, full stop, and we shouldn't judge him. Neither of those is what Wright is offering us here. Wright is offering us something more demanding. He's saying, look at this person. Look at the full architecture of what built him and look at what he did. And do not let one of those observations release you from the other. That is what understanding means. It's not about explaining away or excusing, it's about understanding. And that's exactly what gets books like this challenged and removed from schools, because the moment students start asking those questions about context and conditions, about how harm gets made, they start asking them about the world outside of the classroom too, about their own communities and about the systems that are still operating today. And believe it or not, that's what education is. So I want to close on the question I find perhaps most haunting in Native Son, and it's the one that the third book of the novel, The Trial, forces into the open. When Bigger's on trial, his lawyer, what's his name, Boris Max, makes an argument that is essentially this: you cannot hold this man fully accountable under a system that never gave him full humanity. You cannot demand that someone operate by rules that were never written to include him. And guess what? The court doesn't want to hear it. The crowd doesn't want to hear it. Even Bigger, in some ways, doesn't quite know what to do with it, because he has never been offered a framework for understanding his own life in those terms. Freedom requires options. It requires the realistic possibility of choosing something different, like when your neighborhood is deliberately underfunded, or when schools are under resourced, when every job that's available to you puts you in the most vulnerable position possible. When fear is the water that you swim in, freedom becomes this theoretical concept. It is not a lived reality. And that's not to say that no one in those conditions ever builds a different life, because people do. That's not the point. The point is that the conditions themselves are a form of violence. It is this slow, structural, and largely invisible threat to people who don't live inside them. Just want to point out, Wright published this novel in 1940. And the reason it's still being banned and challenged in 2026 is because the conditions that he described then have not disappeared today. They've merely evolved. The geography has shifted, the specific laws have changed, but the architecture of constraint that he was writing about, the way certain communities are set up to fail and then blamed for failing, that is still there. It's still here. And that's why this book matters, not because it is comfortable, but not because Bigger Thomas is someone that you're supposed to root for without complication. It matters because Wright had the courage to say, look at this. Look at this whole thing. Don't let the violence be the only story that you're willing to tell. And that brings us right back to where we started. In the conversation I described at the top of the episode, people were doing what we often do. They were assigning blame because assigning blame feels like a resolution. It feels like we've done something. We've named who is responsible and we've drawn a line. But understanding, real understanding, is a lot slower than that. And it requires sitting with discomfort and holding that complexity. It requires asking more than just what someone did, but what built the conditions in which they did it. Native Son and Richard Wright demands that of us. And that demand is exactly why certain institutions want it out of the hands of students. Because a student who reads this type of book and learns to ask those questions about conditions and contexts and systems is a student who is willing to ask those questions everywhere. And that I would argue is exactly the point. So before you go, I want to ask something of you, and I mean this directly. This episode is part of a larger conversation that goes beyond this podcast. Right now, books like Native Son are being removed from school libraries and curricula across this country. And the organization Color of Change has a campaign called Stop Silencing Our Black Stories, and they're working to push back against that erasure. Here's what I'm asking you to do. You can do all three if you can. One, I want you to read the book, because if you haven't read Native Son, read it. If you have, consider what it would mean for a student today to encounter it for the first time or be told that they can't. The second thing is to sign the petition. I want you to go to Color of Change's website, or I want you to find the link in this bio and add your name to the Stop Silencing Our Black Stories petition. It takes 2 minutes and it matters. The last thing is I want you to share this episode. If something today made you think, it made you uncomfortable, it made you want to push back on easy answers, send it to someone who needs to hear it. The margins are not a safe place to keep our stories because they belong in the center of the conversation. I'm Dr. James Bell III. This is Equity Matters, and this is In the Margins. I'll see you on the next one.